Welcome to prophecy expert Dr. Bozo's International Old-Time Gospel Hour of Power. Prophecy in the News, Rapture, Study on the Last Days, End Times, Book of Revelation.
Thank you for joining us today. Oh, what an exciting time we live in these last days, end times, just before the rapture is a-coming. Today we're going to read what it says in the book of Revelations in chapter 14, which is one of my favorite chapters, because it's all about the end of the world, which of course the whole book is too. But chapter 14 is all about my favorite time, and that time is Armageddon. I just love Armageddon. I just can't wait to get enough of it. In fact, I say it everywhere in the book of Revelations. Anytime I read the text in Revelations, I just immediately think, this must be Armageddon. I just love saying the word even. Armageddon, Armageddon, Armageddon. Woo-wee. Isn't that something? Now looky here. Chapter 14 is about how God's going to harvest the whole earth. Now, how you know that, Mr. Dr. Bozo? Well, you might ask. Well, because it says so right there in the bold title in the King James Version. And if you can't read the bold title in the King James Bible, you need to go back to seminary. I mean, after all, you can't be too far off if you stick to the bold title, right? That's really all you need. That's all you have to know, the whole book of Revelation. That's all I do. And if anyone understands the book of Revelations, it's me, because I've been in the ministry for 20 years preaching the bold titles in the KJV. I understand the whole book by just reading those titles in bold, so you can too. Somebody said to me one time, but Dr. Bozo, them titles ain't in Greek. Well, you want to know what I said back to her? I said, well, your Bible's written in English, and it's in English. That ought to be enough for you. Besides, when's the last time you seen a Jesus movie and Jesus wasn't speaking in English? That's when he's always speaking in English, because that's what he spoke in. The Bible, King James Bible, is written in English, because that's what Jesus spoke, and that's why he says thou and thither and thous. That's called Elizabethan English, and that was the language Jesus spoke in, because it was a long time ago, back when they only had radios in the BBC. Now, look here, in chapter 14, in verses 1 through 5, King James writes about God's chosen people who is all harp-playing man virgins. For some reason, King James is talking about musical man virgins, and then in verse 6 through 13, King James starts prophesying about drinking wine for some reason. And then in verses 14 through 20, he talks about a big old wine vat, but that's really all about Armageddon, because see, it says they're going to be blood all the way up to the horse's bridle, and some of them secular liberals say, that's impossible. But I say, no, it ain't. Not if the horse lays on its side, and that's probably what it means. But the horse is sort of like on its side, and maybe like just leaning over a little bit, and maybe like at a 45-degree angle, because the riders are all kind of too fat, and they weigh too much, and it makes a horse lean over sideways or something like that. But it's definitely literal, because it's Armageddon. And what Armageddon is, how you gonna have Armageddon without blood going up to the horse's bridle? Them secular humanists, they ain't got no sense, because they ain't read the Bible, especially the titles in bold that God put there for them in the KJV. Now, you may say, but Dr. Bozo, wine and music and virgins ain't got nothing to do with Armageddon. And Armageddon ain't even mentioned anywhere in the chapter. But that doesn't matter, because not everything has to be what you read is. Sometimes you just gotta believe because I say it is. You know, a lot of this just comes from imagination, because that's given to us by the Christmas spirit, which is what you need to understand. The KJV Holy Bible is the right way anyway. Because, see, the holiday spirit done revealed to me nothing will make you think about virgins and drinking wine more than just thinking about Armageddon. At least it does me. Every time I hear the word Armageddon, I start thinking about drinking an expensive wine like Boone's Farm, Strawberry Hill, and like a Christmas cantata with some musical man virgins. That's really good Armageddon wine, by the way, that Strawberry Hill. So, from reading chapter 14 in Revelations and the titles in bold, we know what's going to happen in the end times, which is today. We are going to see this really big angel flying in the sky, and he's going to preach the gospel just like Billy Graham did on TV about accepting Jesus in your heart. And when he's done preaching after the altar call, and the end is going to come. China going to invade Russia. Russia is going to invade Florida, and the African nations all going to line and invade New York, and the Philippines, they're going to invade Taiwan. Woo-wee, boom! And it's Armageddon. And everything in the whole earth is going to be completely destroyed on earth. And then we're going to go to chapter 15 in Revelations, which is when the bowl judgments come and Armageddon. I know. How can you have Armageddon after Armageddon already happened? But see, with God, all things are possible. Just read the titles in bold at the top of the text with the Christmas spirit, and you'll understand everything I'm telling you is true. Amen. Praise God. Hallelujah.
Thank you for joining us today for the International Hour of Power, Old Time Gospel Hour, Book of Revelations, Prophecy in the News show. Remember to send in your gifts and offerings and help support this vital ministry to the world. And remember, we take cash and credit, and whatever you can send, make sure and send it in to continue to receive.
Dr. Bozo's explanation of Revelation chapter 14 is that this text is all about Armageddon, and nothing more. But that explanation ignores virtually all the detail of the entire chapter. A chapter which does not even mention Armageddon. You just saw in chapter 13 that John prophesied the creation of an absolute monarchy by the Roman Empire, and that it would consist of an east and west ruler which John called the first and second beast. That it would be religious in nature. That it would preach the worship of icons which would speak to people. That it would have a miracle of fire from heaven that would deceive people. And that it would have 3 rulers by the name 6, the third of which would bear the name of 3 sixes, 666. All of which actually literally really happened in history precisely the way that John prophesied it would. But you have also seen that in order to hide the fulfillment of those prophecies from the public, the Counter-Reformation devised 2 explanations for the book of Revelation. One was known as preterism, which essentially claimed everything John wrote was directed at Nero and pagan Rome, and was all in the past from John's day. This claim was so incredulous, it never gained any serious traction among Christians at large. The second explanation was called futurism, and instead of shifting everything to the past, tried the opposite approach, and shifted everything to the faraway future, to within 7 years only, which they arbitrarily called the Tribulation, at the end of the world. This explanation, known as futurism, unlike preterism, did gain popularity, and was promoted by Counter-Reformation groups and organizations, such as the Jesuits and the Masons, within Protestantism. But to really appreciate how horrifically awful this explanation of Revelation really is, completely aside from its treatment of the texts in Revelation themselves, as ink blots for free association, is their completely fantastical, superstitious and comical explanations of reality itself. To really appreciate how bad these explanations are, you really have to stop and think about what they are telling you. If you had not been conditioned to normalize these false claims in a religious context, you would walk away from these descriptions thinking you had just had a conversation with someone completely insane. Completely aside from the mangled inaccuracy with the texts themselves, is just the really bad nature of their explanations. If the question is, how far will you go to keep people from hearing the truth about Revelation, then Jesuit futurism is the answer. First, they start everything in the book of Revelation with a fictional rapture that is nowhere to be found in any of its texts, which they just arbitrarily inserted for the sake of theological excuse-making. Rapture preachers that are always babbling about the rapture always being just around the corner at some fictitious point in the very near future, never of course, have any consistent explanations about it. They claim all Christians on Earth will magically fly up into the sky so that not a single Christian is left on the planet before the Antichrist comes. Despite all the warnings to Christians in the New Testament about the Antichrist, and how they are to live faithful even after he is here, they can never really explain who are all the Christians that get raptured, other than it always includes their church group. Do all Christians get raptured? Do half and half Christians get raptured? For example, someone who's half Christian and half Hindu, or half Christian and half Buddhist. What if they are a serial killer who's a Christian? Or perhaps a Christian who practices witchcraft? Do children get raptured? Or just adults beyond the age of accountability? Do they leave their children on Earth all by themselves? Or do children get raptured simply because they have Christian parents? And in that case, do all the other children on Earth get left behind, even if they are really good children, perhaps even godly children? Maybe some of whom would one day become a Christian? None of these questions have any answers from the scriptures, because the doctrine of the rapture really isn't there to begin with. So, they just make-believe answers to these make-believe questions for their make-believe doctrine. All to hide the simple truth: the Antichrist has already come in history, precisely as was prophesied, even bearing the name of 3 6s. After their imaginary rapture, they then take you on their imaginary journey through the rapture land of fantasy and fictions and superstitions. First stop is a magical bottomless pit, never mind the geological logistics and requirements of astrophysics necessary for a bottomless pit in the earth. They assure you the Bible tells you it is there, from which magical demonic bugs fly out, dressed in iron breastplates with human faces, and hair like women. And these magical bugs torture people with stings for 5 months, who for some reason magically cannot die no matter what they do. Even if they jump off a tall building, or shoot themselves in the head, they still magically cannot die. Somewhere along the way on their magical journey, a cosmic asteroid crashes into the Earth, destroying 1/3 of the planet, but everything goes on just like it never happened. And everyone decides to fight a thermonuclear war against the nation of Israel, which is only 290 long by 85 miles wide. And despite the fact Israel is only 290 miles long by 85 miles wide, this thermonuclear war manages to destroy another 1/3 of the planet, yet somehow manages to miss Israel, where the Antichrist is, who is also amazingly in charge of the war against Israel, that he is also in charge of fighting. And despite these 2 extinction-level events, and a planet 2/3 of which that has been obliterated, everyone's TVs still work perfectly fine, where they see on the 6 o'clock evening news, 2 magical prophets in Jerusalem which have magically appeared out of thin air, and are magically breathing fire out of their mouths, and magically burning everyone alive. And all the armies of Earth magically cannot kill them no matter what they do. Until one day it magically does. Then they magically come back from the dead, after being blown to pieces, and magically float up into heaven. And despite all this global death and destruction, despite the fact 2/3 of the Earth has been obliterated in 2 extinction-level events, there is magically no chaos anywhere, and the TVs are still working perfectly fine, and the Antichrist, who is a purely secular ruler, or perhaps a religious leader in some other minority or foreign religion, magically tattoos or chips every single living person on the entire planet Earth, whether it is deep in the Amazon rainforest, or the isolated frozen Arctic North. And magically does this with perfect organization and efficiency on an Earth that is no longer habitable, magically within a few weeks or months, every single place on the entire planet, at exactly the very same time, with complete organizational efficiency. All for the purpose of tracking retail sales. Governments can't even get everyone vaccinated, even in years, even when it is a matter of life and death. And if you have ever been in a war zone, or an area after a natural disaster, the very last thing on earth anyone is doing is retail buying and selling. You can't even get basic services. There is no electricity. There is not even police protection. How are you going to enforce, down to the very last person on earth, in the middle of 2 extinction-level events, an RFD chipping program, to every single geographically remote area on Earth, to every single person alive, on the entire planet, all for the purpose of tracking retail sales, that absolutely no one on Earth would even be doing in the middle of such disasters? It is a completely, utterly, outrageous and ridiculous fictitious claim. It is non-reality, on every level. And now they come to Revelation 14. And according to them, all the details of Revelation 14 should be ignored, and the only text that matters in the entire chapter is verse 20 that states there will be blood to the horse's bridle, which they usually also claim is completely literal and unquestionably all about Armageddon, which is not even mentioned yet, until the next chapter. But the truth of the matter that they are once again hiding from the Christian public is that chapter 14 is a continuing discussion of the topics introduced in chapter 13. John hasn't changed the subject. And you are about to see what they have gone to such an extent to hide. Before we can begin discussing what chapter 14 is really saying, we have to clear away all the layers of disinformation that have been piled on top of this chapter, to intentionally avoid, obfuscate and hide what is actually really there. This is another chapter that has suffered the result of being the target for several layers of disinformation. So before we begin talking about what is there, let's first spend some time on what is not there. And that is what we are going to do in this section. So, what is actually not there in Revelation chapter 14? If you listen to Counter-Reformation Rapture preachers on the internet, they will tell you that chapter 14 begins depicting a heavenly scene, showing the 144,000 after they are either martyred in the tribulation or raptured in heaven. Each Counter-Reformationist Rapture preacher will have his very own explanation for who the 144,000 are. Some will say, these are 144,000 converted Jews from the fictitious 7-year tribulation period, who overnight all decided to just throw away the Shema and become Trinitarian fundamentalist Christians, but then are martyred the moment they do. And now they are in heaven with Christ, in the scene. Other Counter-Reformation Rapture preachers will claim the 144,000 is their church, which has now been raptured, and which is now shown with Christ in heaven. They will claim the rest of the chapter describes what is going on down on earth during their fictitious tribulation period. 3 giant bird-winged Nikes will fly across the sky, circling the globe, speaking in everybody's native language, preaching the gospel, which will sound like a Billy Graham sermon, to accept Jesus into your heart and be a Christian, or else be mercilessly slaughtered by God. It is the supernatural announcement by 3 giant pagan Nikes of a divinely appointed genocide or ethnic cleansing of the whole earth. And then in the last section of chapter 14, the whole earth is harvested, meaning the long-awaited, great final Christian genocide or ethnic cleansing is globally initiated, in the visual symbol of a reaper with a sickle harvesting a wheat field, which is the beginning of Armageddon. And that is the standard explanation for Revelation chapter 14. And unfortunately, not a word of any of that is anywhere in Revelation chapter 14. In fact, those claims are not even close to the details of the actual text in this chapter. and that entire explanation is another example of Counter-Reformation rapture preachers' interpretation by ink-blot-free association. Counter-Reformationist rapture preachers simply ignore the details of all the texts they quote, and they hope you do too. Because if you don't, you will see that there are scores upon scores of grammatical and linguistic details in these texts that flat out contradict what they claim, and of which they simply ignore or hide from their audiences. These absolutely and unequivocally are not raptured people, and they absolutely are not from the end of time, nor the end of the world. There is also nothing in the text that mentions anything about a tribulation, the Great Tribulation, 7 years of tribulation, or tribulation of any kind. And there is nothing about the rapture in chapter 14. There is no heavenly scene of raptured people in chapter 14. There is nothing about converted Trinitarian Jews in chapter 14. Nothing about the end of the world, nothing about the harvest of the whole earth, and there is nothing about Armageddon in the text. And that should be very concerning to you if you believe in Counter-Reformation rapture eschatology, unless of course, you simply do not mind interpreting the whole book of Revelation by ink-blot-free association. The following 12 objective facts demonstrate that all the explanations Counter-Reformation rapture preachers give for Revelation chapter 14 are simply lies. Their explanations are not simply mistakes, because a mistake is something you do unintentionally or without knowing that you did it. These 12 facts demonstrate that preachers who claim to have studied Revelation chapter 14, and claim to be explaining it to you, talking about the rapture and tribulation and Armageddon, are either unbelievably slothful in their studies and are not very intelligent, and honestly do not know any better, or they do know better, but are simply lying about it to the public, because lying is more convenient. But once again, those are the only two options you have. First, the 144,000 are all men. John is quite explicit that he is referring to men, because he says they do not seduce virgins. If these are raptured people, then that means only men get raptured. Second, the 144,000 are written about explicitly in chapter 7. They are said to be sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel no longer exist. So that is a past event. Third, John mentions their martyrdom in chapter 6, and he uses two tenses in chapter 6 verse 11 to describe their martyrdom. The past tense, and the present tense. Present tense is a reference to John's own time of writing in 95 or 96 AD. Fourth, verse 11 also makes it clear in the language, the remainder are quote, about to be killed, in a short time. A short time from 95 AD does not refer to thousands of years later at the end of the world. John rules that out in his own words. Fifth, John states explicitly, in chapter 1 verse 9, that at the time of his writing in 95 or 96 AD, he is in the tribulation. John uses both the definite article in the Greek, and the present tense. Present tense is 95 or 96 AD. The fictitious 7-year tribulation period at the end of time is a Counter-Reformation hoax, not the teaching of the scriptures. Sixth, the Greek word, cosmos, translated in the King James Bible, for world, is not used anywhere in chapter 14, and the Greek word translated earth, simply means land, and nothing else. The words earth and world are nowhere in this text, in the Greek. Seventh, what is being harvested is a vineyard, not a wheat field. 8th, and the harvesting tool is a small handheld vine pruner, not a wheat sickle. 9th, Armageddon is not even mentioned until another chapter later. And 10th, Counter-Reformation rapturists claim this is the continuing saga of the tribulation period, which they also identify chapter 11 with. But John gives his own time frame for chapter 11, and he explicitly states it is 42 months after the giving of Jerusalem to the Gentiles. According to rapture eschatology that rejects historicist prophetic dating that is explicitly used in the book of Daniel, they insist that 42 months is a literal 42 months, which would place John's time frame for the end of the world, and their tribulation period, actually between 133 and 138 AD. Because Jerusalem was given to the Gentiles as John prophesied in 130 AD. So the whole thing would have been over thousands of years ago. And as you saw in chapter 10, if you use the same dating method that was used in the book of Daniel, it puts you right in the middle of history, beginning with the 7 voices, and the Lollard movement, and the publication of the Bible into common language, which was the actual beginning of the Reformation. And, in verse 8 John brings up Babylon, which he explains in chapter 18 in more detail. He states his reference to Mystery Babylon is that great city which is ruling over the kings of the earth, and once again, he uses the present tense, in 95 or 96 AD. That is the great city that is ruling over the kings of the earth in 95 or 96 AD. Which was a very clear and unmistakable reference to the city of Rome. Nobody but propagandizing counter-reformationists get confused over that reference, and neither do counter-reformationists, really. They just prefer to lie about it to the public, because that is who they are, and lying is what they do. So you see, factually speaking, there is no rapture, tribulation or Armageddon anywhere in Revelation chapter 14. And in fact, those were the lies invented to hide the contents of Revelation chapter 14 from the public. So, if that is not what is in Revelation chapter 14, what is Revelation chapter 14 really about? That is what you are about to find out, next. In Acts chapter 9, the story of the conversion of the Apostle Paul is told. In the narrative, Paul as a trained rabbi, under Gamaliel, zealously persecuted the early ecclesia, going from house to house, arresting and prosecuting them. Because of his personal prejudice and pride in his rabbinical training, he could not see the truth of what he was doing. Until he saw a blinding light, which spoke to him as the Lord. The text says that afterwards, he had scales on his eyes and was blinded by the light. A disciple named Ananias was then told to go to the house where Paul was staying, and pray for him. Which Ananias did, and the scales fell from his eyes, and Paul was able to see. And this story has become a symbol for how we are blinded by sin, until the scales fall from our eyes, and we can see the truth. Revelation chapter 14 has been hidden from sight by the same kind of scales over our eyes. Revelation chapter 14 is in reality a very simple and straightforward chapter. Without all the obfuscation offered by the Counter-Reformation concerning its actual textual content, it would be easily recognizable when compared with the historical period it is addressing. But thanks to the work of the Counter-Reformation, all that simplicity and clarity is completely lost to modern Pavlovian conditioned audiences, whose minds are wrongly filled with imaginary raptures and fictitious tribulations when they read this chapter. It's really almost completely impossible to describe just how bad their cover story really is for this chapter. There are many places in the book of Revelation where Counter-Reformation rapture eschatology completely deviates from the actual text, but there are very few places in the entire book where they deviate so bad from what is actually written than they do here. This particular text ranks up at the top of the list, with few others. To find a comparison, it would be almost like if someone claimed Benjamin Franklin's attributed proverb that says, "Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy and wise." We're about the subject of broccoli. If you heard such a claim, you would so recognize it as false that you would be provoked to laughter, thinking the claim was probably intentional comedy. That is precisely how bad the Counter-Reformation rapture eschatology explanation of Revelation 14 actually is, by not much of an exaggeration. It is seriously that bad. A lot of people would assume, hearing these statements, they must be simply hyperbole. Surely, it couldn't really literally be that bad. That must be illustrative effect and hyperbolic commentary. But no, that is pretty much what it actually literally is. There is no better way to illustrate this concrete fact than by using an objective statistical analysis from the language of the text itself, which we are actually going to do right now. Revelation 14 consists of 20 verses. The chapter is divided into 3 distinct sections of texts. Each of the 3 sections of texts contain a prophetic theme, totaling 3 main prophecies, and each of the 3 prophecies are contexted around the theme found in that section of text. In Bible study training, one of the techniques that is taught is something called the keyword or key concept study. That is where you go through every single verse in a chapter or text, and you read the verse, and then list one main key concept or keyword to summarize what the verse is discussing. After you have gone through the entire chapter of verses, you then look at the list of terms it produces to see the big picture of the chapter. This is often used to get a clear picture of the overall context of what the chapter or text is actually literally discussing with an audience, word for word. When you do that with Revelation chapter 14, and focus on the objects of discussion, this is what such a keyword or key concept survey produces. In section 1, which is verses 1 through 5, you see the words, martyrs, musicians, singing, virgins and sermons. In section 2, you see, gospel, worship, wine, icons, commandments, Sabbath or rest. In section 3, you see throne, temple, throne, altar, wine, blood. And that is the list of keywords or key concepts for all 20 verses in Revelation chapter 14. Now here is what is absolutely amazing about what you discover in this keyword or key concept verse-by-verse study of this entire chapter. In order to get to the Counter-Reformation Rapture eschatology's explanation of this chapter, you have to literally ignore all but 4 words in this entire chapter. You have to literally ignore virtually everything you see in this chapter. Because if you actually pay attention to what is actually in the chapter, you will see absolutely nothing related to their explanation. It is literally fabricated out of thin air and transposed onto this chapter using ink-blot-free association. According to their explanation, the Antichrist is some political secular anti-Christian world ruler. He is not religious at all. They want to cast the Antichrist as a secularist, because the Vatican is trying to network all the world's religious leaders under its administrative authority out of the Vatican. So it doesn't want religious leaders of any kind made a particular target for identification as the Antichrist, including and especially itself. So religious leaders are out. The only problem, of course, is that the scriptures are absolutely unmistakable in identifying the man of sin, the Antichrist, the son of perdition, etc., is definitely a religious leader, and a religious leader that is particularly Christian. Because he comes in Christ's name, and claims to be him. That is as religious as it can possibly get. But counter-reformationist propagandists really do not care what the Bible really says about any of this. They are completely focused on their political outcomes, and will tell any kind of lie necessary to get what they want. That is their operational ethics. That is simply how they operate. They see no value in what is true or not true. And when it comes to chapter 14, they want you to see this entire chapter as being about the rule of this secularist world ruler, the tribulation on the secular world ruler, and the battle of Armageddon, where the secular world ruler is defeated. And this is all supposed to be in Revelation chapter 14. It is all focused on God's judgment on a secular society with its secular ruler, and its military battle. So according to them, the entire chapter is discussing God's judgment on a secular political and military scenario. Which is extremely odd. Because when you look at the keywords list for the entire chapter, you do not see anything that even remotely looks like that. In fact, to show how extreme this deviation really is from the facts of the text, we created a spreadsheet chart to actually figure out what the statistical percentages of the text actually show. On our chart, we list the verse number in the first column. Then we list the keyword, or key concept. Then in the next column, we mark the keywords or key concepts, which could be taken to refer to political or military references. And then we mark the column, which keywords or key concepts could be taken as ecclesiastical or religious references. If they could be taken either way, then we put a mark in both columns. In the first column, there were only 4 words that could refer to a political military interpretation. The first word was martyrs in verse 1. The word throne in verses 14 and 16. And blood to the horse's bridle in verse 20. In the next column under references to ecclesiastical religious, you will discover that every single verse in the chapter is applicable. Including the reference to martyrs, thrones because they are ecclesiastical thrones, and blood, because blood is the subject of ecclesiastical sacrament. And if you take the 2 references to thrones as they are given in the text in the context of religious, those 2 would not really be applicable to political military. Meaning the actual number would be reduced by half. And what you see is shown in the chart to the left. The political military column gets at best only 20%. but is really actually only 10%. The ecclesiastical religious column, however, gets 100%. And what counter-reformationists are asking their audience to do is ignore the column that is 100% and see what is only 10% of the chapter, at best. So it is very much like seeing broccoli, in Benjamin Franklin's saying, "Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy and wise." If you have no problem thinking Benjamin Franklin was talking about broccoli, then you will have no problem thinking that Revelation chapter 14 is what Counter-Reformation rapture preachers say it is as well. But good luck with that. Revelation chapter 14 contains some of the most serious warnings in the entire Bible. And if you intentionally want to hide what those warnings are really referring to, you probably deserve to go to hell for it. Just as John promises, in Revelation chapter 14, you actually will. The fact of the matter is that Revelation 14 has nothing to say about a secular world ruler who is ruling a post-rapture world during a 7-year tribulation at the end of time, being circled by 3 giant preaching Nikes, and which is being harvested in Armageddon. But what it does have 20 verses to say, the Counter-Reformation would rather have you believe any lie on earth than no. The question is, when John says the stakes of this information very well could be your own eternal destiny, can you really afford not to know the truth? As stated previously, Revelation chapter 14 consists of 3 distinct sections, which total 20 verses. Each section contains a prophetic theme with a prophecy. But what is amazing about Revelation chapter 14 is how Counter-Reformation eschatology has managed to use misdirection to completely hide the actual literal content of the chapter from view. And it really is amazing when you begin to look at the details of what they have accomplished. John has written chapter 14 in such a way that he made some things so completely obvious, there is absolutely no way anyone could possibly miss seeing them. And yet you will see scores and scores of ministers and thousands upon thousands of Christians do precisely that. They will read over the most obvious things and never once even notice they are there. And this is the result of something known in psychology as Pavlovian conditioning. Most people who have been to college are familiar with the term Pavlovian conditioning, which is also called classical conditioning or respondent conditioning. Simply put, Ivan Pavlov was a Russian psychologist who published the results of his experiments in 1897 with dogs. He studied the effect of association on dogs. Pavlov noticed that just prior to eating, when dogs were anticipating their meal, saliva would begin excreting in their mouths. So he experimented by creating an association with the coming of the food in the mind of the dog, by turning on a metronome just prior to being fed. And Pavlov discovered that after a few consistent repetitions of this routine, the sound of the metronome had conditioned the dog to expect its meal, and just the sound alone would create the rise in saliva. And that effect is known today as Pavlovian conditioning. The Counter-Reformation has been very effective in using Pavlovian conditioning to manipulate the public. And one of the areas you can see the direct effect of their work is on how people have been conditioned to read the book of Revelation and completely miss the most obvious stuff in its content. They will read over it and never see it sitting there. And that is because they are experiencing a Pavlovian conditioned response to the text. While there are many very good examples of that process in operation, when it comes to the book of Revelation, one of the best examples is chapter 14. There are some things that are so completely obvious, and yet somehow, they are never even seen, that only Pavlovian conditioning can explain the discrepancy. For example, beginning in section 2 and continuing all the way through section 3, between verse 8 and the end of the chapter in verse 20, there are a total of 12 verses. In those 12 verses, terms, phrases and references related to wine, its serving, its drinking, and its production, occur 19 times in only 12 verses. Once again, that is 19 times, in only 12 verses. There are more references to it than there are even verses. Meaning that verses 8 through 20 are completely saturated with the subject of wine. Or in other words, it is a completely obvious major theme of the entire second half of the chapter. Yet, you would never even know that at all, If you listen to most preachers, and most Christians talking about chapter 14, the subject of wine as a topic doesn't even come up at all. It is only mentioned by them when the word is cited in the text, when they are reading the text, and completely ignoring its presence there. In fact, wine has almost nothing to do with their explanation of the chapter at all. It doesn't even merit a topical mention at all. Despite the fact there are approximately 19 references to it, within the span of only 12 verses. That is a textual saturation level of 158%. How can you possibly miss a topic that is mentioned 19 times in only 12 verses and has a textual saturation of 158%? How? Well, that is the result of Pavlovian conditioning. So you see, Counter-Reformation Rapture eschatology is a propaganda form that is used to create conditioned responses in the public, so that they never see even the most obvious things, even when it is literally staring them in the face. But since we are here to deprogram you from Counter-Reformation Pavlovian conditioning in the book of Revelation, we are going to point out to you the simple unmistakable fact that the subject of wine, its serving, drinking and production, is referred to approximately 19 times in only 12 verses, making it one of the most obvious themes in Revelation chapter 14. The subject of wine is hugely important to John in Revelation chapter 14. And you cannot possibly read Revelation chapter 14 and miss that fact, unless you are simply the victim of Pavlovian conditioning. That is why you do not want to waste too much time getting taught the scriptures by a counter-reformationist minister. They are really doing nothing more than brainwashing you with propaganda that will put scales over your eyes and lead to spiritual blindness. Because if you are conditioned in such a way that you cannot even see the most obvious element of a text, then how on earth are you going to be able to get anything right at all about the text from that point forward? The truth is, you can't. If you cannot see wine is a major element of John's focus in chapter 14, how on earth are you going to accurately understand what he is even talking about when he discusses Mystery Babylon, which he is now introducing here in this chapter? And he directly ties his definition of the identity of that reference to the very same wine he spends 19 allusions on in this chapter. Wine is a major identifier of his reference to Babylon. If you don't see the wine, then you cannot possibly understand his reference to Babylon. Because he directly mentions them together, not once, but twice, both in verse 8 and verse 10, just in case you didn't get it the first time. And whatever you think Babylon is in the book of Revelation, if wine is not an obvious and major part of it, you are not talking about the same thing John was. Because his definition of what he is referring to puts wine at the very center of what he is describing. This obviously would not be true of all the phony political Babylon substitutions that counter-reformationists are always offering up to the public. They intentionally never even make the connection. And because the counter-reformationists can never even admit to the audience the most obvious topics in the text aren't even actually there, they certainly can never even tell you why John put it there to begin with. Because before you can begin understanding why something has been written, you must first admit it's actually there, which they can never actually do. But there was obviously a reason why John spent 12 verses mentioning the subject of wine 19 times in every phase of its production. Because it is a major reason for why Revelation chapter 14 was written. And of course, wine has nothing to do with raptures and tribulations and Armageddon. Nothing whatsoever to do with those things. And that is precisely why they can never acknowledge one of the main focuses of this chapter is clearly and obviously about wine. And if you can't admit that, you are not even seeing the text of the chapter. But what was it about wine that had John so worked up that he literally prophesied, if you drink this wine, you will unconditionally be damned by God for all eternity, unless you repent? What kind of wine could possibly be so evil, so wrong, so abominable to God in heaven, that if you drink it, you will spend eternity under the wrathful judgment of God, unless you repent? What cup is John describing that offers this wine? How could it possibly be so bad that it not only earns the wrathful vengeance of God in eternity? From verses 14 through 20, John even prophesies the vineyard where it is produced will be utterly and completely destroyed. And this wine, and the vineyard where it is produced, as you have probably already guessed, have nothing to do with raptures and a tribulation period and Armageddon. but it does have everything to do with wine, precisely as the text says. And that is this very same wine that is the focus of John's 3 prophecies in Revelation, chapter 14. A wine the Counter-Reformationist doesn't even want you to see is even there. And there is a very good reason the Counter-Reformationist has gone to such lengths to keep you from seeing anything about this wine in Revelation 14. Because it is the very same wine the Counter-Reformationist is actually promoting and protecting with his lies about raptures and tribulations. And, unless you see the wine John is referring to prophetically in this text, you do not even see what John has written, even though you may be reading it word for word. As you saw in the previous section, wine is a major theme of Revelation 14. And you really cannot explain Revelation chapter 14 and ignore John's discussion of wine unless you are just trying to hide his reference to it. In fact, you really cannot understand anything about this chapter unless you place wine in your explanation of it in the same proportion that John writes about it in his text. Because that is why John is writing about it. It is a major theme of Revelation chapter 14, and it is the main focus of his entire prophecy, which concludes the chapter. In fact, when we come to section 3 of chapter 14, the entire section is about God bringing judgment on the vintage or vineyard of that wine. John prophesies that God is going to completely obliterate where that wine is produced. So the end of chapter 14 is not about Armageddon at all, but the destruction of the vineyard that produced that wine for Rome, which John is calling Babylon. And of course, wine has nothing to do with Armageddon. Because Armageddon has nothing to do with this text. In the next video, we will begin our exegesis of the texts of Revelation 14, and see what John was really saying, and why the Counter-Reformation has gone to such lengths to keep it intentionally hidden from the public. Don't miss the exciting discoveries you will make in the original uncensored texts of Revelation chapter 14. Thank you for watching.